Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Whip Union, and in this one we have a very significant Russian advance in the Pokrovsk section of the front line. The Russians have managed to break through the Ukrainian lines in the southeast near Selydove, and this has led to several Russian advances in the area. We start out in the Robotine direction, where the Russians have managed to capture a significant portion of the pocket that the Ukrainians were in, advancing up to the central parts past the main forest area and up to the fortified position of the Ukrainians here in the northern direction. And this advance was confirmed with this geolocated footage here. You'll see that the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians away from Robotine and are about to close the final pocket of the Ukrainian positions in the area. Moving on to the next section, we see here in the direction of Vuhledar, northeast of Vuhledar, the Russians have managed to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. We see that it is present on the satellite imagery. There are several trenches, there's a ammo depot, there's several firing positions for vehicles. So this is a well-fortified position of the Ukrainians. The Russians have now captured this, which solidifies their control over the road here in between Vuhledar and Konstantinivka. At the same time, there's a small advance of the Russians within the town itself and to the south of it. So we see that the Russians are looking to gain full control over the road all the way down south from Konstantinivka to Vuhledar. The capture of this fortified position allows the Russians to start an offensive operation towards Sodiane. This would lead to a double offensive operation, both in the direction of Sodiane and Konstantinivka at the same time. Gaining control of both would allow the Russians to then push onwards towards beyond Vuhledar and onwards towards Novohrodivka, which they could be opting out of firing in the direction of Vuhledar, considering the previous failures, and simply ignoring it completely. Or they could use this to move towards the coal plant here in the northeast of Vuhledar, gain control of the heights, and then push down towards Vuhledar from a wide front, both from the southwest, southeast, and northeast. Further north in the direction of Novohrodivka, there was this small advance by the Russians from the town itself to the forest lines here to the northeast. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the south of the lake here in the northeast. To secure the northern flank of Novohrodivka, move onwards towards the rest of Maximilianivka and west of Krasnohorivka. The objective here is to reach Ohostre, gain control over Maximilianivka, and cut off the southern road here in the Vovcha River direction. This would cut off the connection between Korohove and the northern parts in connection with the Russian breakthrough by the Pokrovsk direction. The Russians have managed to capture the heights here to the northeast of Selydove, managed to capture Mikhailivka completely within a single day. They have moved on to the suburbs here east of Selydove. They've also managed to reach Memrik and gain a foothold within the village, as well as capture the fortified positions before them. They've also managed to capture the fortified positions north of Kalinove and gain a foothold within Kalinove. They've also managed to capture the fortified positions east of Kalinove. And to the northwest by Novohrodivka, the Russians have managed to capture the central parts of the town and are advancing further in the southern parts as well, capturing the fortified positions to the north and northeast of the town and reach the northern parts of the town. So we see several advances by the Russians in Novohrodivka, and this is a significant development in their favor. All of these advances were reported in a mix of reports by Syriac Maps and Deep State Map. So we see that the Russian advances here is front-breaking, as it allows the Russians to now be in a very strong position. We see here in the Kalinova direction, the Russians are connecting the crossing by Karelivka with the advances to the north. There's this one final fortified position that they need to gain control of, and it will connect the Russian positions in the east with the ones from the north. This will strengthen the Russian ability to conduct offensive operations here in the north, as it shortens the connection between the Tailove and the front with a very, very significant distance, as otherwise they would have to go all the way beyond from Progress and then down south. They then captured some crossings here in the center, and now with a crossing right by Karelivka, they can cross over really quick. Connecting the two fronts would allow the Russians to move both in the eastern direction and western direction of Karelivka and coordinate a strike from both sides. At the same time, with the heights, they have managed to gain a significant advance. And if they manage to continue pushing along the fortified positions, they would be able to move onwards to the next target, which would be the heights here by Ukrainsk, and then move further south towards Hirnik, which is the largest town in the area. Therefore, we see that with the current advances, this is the beginning of the Russians reaching the next defensive position of the Ukrainians, and that is the chain of towns and villages here by the Vovcha river line, as well as the separate chain of villages and towns by the railways. Both of these are fortified positions that the Russians have to gain control of here in the next coming time. They're likely going to be aiming for the railway connection, as that would cut off the river line chain completely, especially if they connect with a capture of Hostre and Maximilianivka to the south. That would completely cut off any supply going in and out of the village chain along the river line. Therefore, we'll likely see a main push going through from the western parts, and a supportive push as they move slowly from the north towards the south along the river line. In the Novohrodivka direction, the recent advances shows that the Ukrainian defenses within the town have completely collapsed, and the Russians are now going to capture the town at any moment. It could already have been captured, considering that we get our news delayed with a day or two. So we see that the Ukrainian positions by Novohrodivka have completely collapsed, and this would lead to the Russians moving on to the third and final line of defense ahead of Pokrovsk, and the Russians would start their offensive operations in that direction. They already have control of Kurchia, they have positions in the foothold in the southeast of Krasny Yar, and this will allow the Russians to attack their fortified positions on a slightly wider front, and this will allow them to attack it from multiple points, both in the east beyond the fortified positions and high ground, and then flanking from Novohrodivka, and then moving on to Sokoyar as well. These are three separate points to attack at. At the same time, they already have control of the eastern parts of Rodivka, which could point towards a push here in the eastern parts to try and connect both sides in a pincer maneuver. That is it for the Pokrovsk front. In the Toretsk direction, there's been a small advance by the Russians in the Dacha area. This area I was connected, although it says government office, this is a prison. You see that there are walls around it, there are fences, there are watchtowers in some areas, and then we also see that there are general buildings for the prison areas. This is used by the Ukrainians as a fortified position and a military base during this frontline fighting. So therefore, the Russians will have to break through this position as a main defensive position of the Ukrainians before they can move into the central parts of the city. This is why the Russians are moving on to the hill nearby. Gaining control of that would give the Russians full overview over the prison, and will then allow them to push into the central parts of the city. So you see that there are several fights and developments taking place in Toretsk direction as well, and it is a step-by-step process. In the direction of Pishana, there's a small advance by the Russians southwest of the town as they move further towards the forest areas to gain a strong flank south of the town, ahead of pushing towards the Usk river line to avoid any Ukrainian counterattacks. In the Kursk section of the front line, we see that the Russians have secured the Koronevo direction by regaining control over the eastern parts along the river line, as well as the northeastern parts by recapturing Gorovka, Shevolovka, and most of Ulgovka, which only leaves the Ukrainians with a small foothold in the eastern parts of the village. So we see that the Russians have strengthened their positions here in the Kursk direction. The Ukrainians in turn are attacking here to the southwest of Koronevo, where they have started operations here along the same river, the southern bank of it. In the eastern side, the Ukrainians have made an advance in Malaya Luknia, which is one of the towns that are very important for the Russian defense in the Kursk region, and the Russian prison here in Malaya Luknia, which was also used by the Russians, similarly to how the Ukrainians are using their own, as a position where they are using it as a military base and fortified position. In the eastern parts, further east, there are some DRGs of the Ukrainians moving further north. So we see that there is some presence here in the Nechaev direction as well, as is seen with this geolocated footage. And that's all for the frontline changes. In regards to the strikes from yesterday, there is this map which was created to talk about the results of the strikes, the missile strikes, and the drone strikes. We see that the mark for water is areas where water management was disrupted or cancelled or stopped completely. The same with the electricity, and then the fires is strikes where they were targets were other than the critical infrastructure. We see that the main strike was clearly energy infrastructure, and then there was a secondary output towards the water infrastructure, and then there were several actual strikes, and these were all targeted at airfields and other military targets. I mentioned the possibility of a third wave. Turns out that rather than a third wave, they are striking yet again today, the extent of which is still unknown. As for the strike yesterday, it was confirmed to be the largest strike so far, as Ukrainian official sources have stated. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my page for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.